conversation in the middle of, I think, in the middle of a moment, such a critical moment in which we are living currently in the world. I think that perhaps I'm just starting to wake up, but some of you are already ahead in the day and have seen as well. For instance, the results of the how the results of the elections in US are going, and also reflecting when thinking about gender, when thinking about social inclusion from a feminist perspective. I think that this type of geopolitical context is something that we cannot, let's say, avoid to reflect on and to not be affected by, and to not see how this will be overall detrimental as well for the collective advocacy work for achieving as well gender equality. And I think that in that sense as well, the picture of the geopolitical context that is happening currently, not only in the US, but also what is happening in the Palestine genocide, the genocide against Palestine, in Lebanon, in Sudan, and in many, 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 many other corners, push us to go deeply into our analysis. That push us as well to go deeply into understanding the different and multiple connections in which a colonial, imperialist, and capitalist empire is spreading their power in different forms. And if we are meant to really strive for a life in dignity for all, we do need to make an extra push. We do need to make a harder or a deeper reflection in interconnecting all of these different elements. And the reason why I start that is to kind of walk us through today through many different reflections from why gender, how is gender interconnected with climate, but also how gender is interconnected with many different layers of oppression, and why it is important to see it all, and what does that have to do with inclusion, with an approach as well that can lead us to a transformative systemic change. And these also based on a lot of different work. So I am I'm serving as one of the co-focal points of the Women and Gender Constituency. The Women and Gender Constituency is one of the official and recognized groups, networks by the UNFCCC, that is the Convention for Climate Change within the United Nations. And we are home of more than thousands of advocates and activists that are working in the intersection of these different elements in the multilateral space. And the work that we do is based on collective work, regional work, in which we do not come perhaps with individual organizational agendas, rather how we create that collective advocacy by echoing the different struggles, the different needs, the different priorities, the different visions, imaginaries, and dreams of activists and advocates around the world. So part of what I'm going to say and what I'm going to be exploring as well in this session, or in this introduction for the webinar, is as well part of that work, that the collective work that I have been doing in other spaces, such as, for example, in the degrowth space, but also in spaces with migrant communities in the global north. So let me start by exposing them, but saying how what I was framing at the beginning, how gender, how the different layers of oppression are based under the same root, that same colonial and imperialist root that has exploited the territories, that has determined the means and the modes of production, and that has also commodified our bodies, our territories, in which our bodies are passing from that human, let's say, category, from that love category, to see how we are turned into objects of economic economic desire. And by transforming that into that economic capitalist desire, then we see how the erosion of different cultural traditions, the erosion of traditional modes of living livelihoods, it have been as well eroded and have been as well putting at risk, not only in the physical way, but also in those elements that we cannot see anymore. And I will come to that in a moment. As well, that same colonial, imperialist, patriarchal, and capitalist route have determined different roles that have then increased that layers of inequity, right? It has been that imperialist project that has shaped as well how borders, imaginary borders, are being framed, no, are being drawn all around the world, and how we see how the result of those borders are also affecting so much and are exacerbating so much different forms of discrimination against racialized communities, against women, against migrants, and against other different identities. So it is important as well to have all that and pack all that into what is the same root, right? Because if we're thinking about gender, if we are thinking about feminist perspectives, and if we are thinking about included women in different systems, we need to be reflecting into which systems are we actually advocating for to include women or to include gender non-conforming people, right? And what is as well the purpose of included people into the different systems, perhaps of oppression. And when thinking about all those different layers of those roots of colonialism, then we also enter to understand how that exploitation has happened in the Global South. So for instance, in the Global South, we see how there has been an unequal exchange, no, and a dependency relation from the South and the North. And what does that mean, that unequal exchange? An unequal exchange is basically when we are talking about how from the South, no, we have been experiencing the exploitation, the extraction, not only of the raw material through the different extractivist processes such as coal or such as lithium or such as ore and others, is yes, the raw material, but what does that entail? That entails as well the extraction and the occupation of land. That also entails the use of energy metrics within that country, and that also implies the labor and the time of people on the ground that is being extracted, that is being reduced from their own country to all in all exported to the north for perpetuating the luxus and the comfort of the North in these different multiple crises. And why I'm saying all of that is because all that unequal exchange is actually based and is actually grounded in one of the biggest and historical subsidies, and is the unpaid, unrecognized, and unvalued care and domestic work of women and people, diverse people, gender non-conforming people, right? This is what holds the entire capitalist system. And this, I am trying to make the long story short, right, due to time, but if we see that, this is what we need as well to have in our analysis when we are moving into proposing climate action, into proposing policies, into proposing disruptive actions, right? Because all this extraction, all this unequal exchange, what is doing is that is fueling and is perpetuating the expansion of sacrifice zones, racial sacrifice zones, right? Those zones that, because of their pollution, because of their extraction processes, are no longer habitable. I think that's the word in English, are not longer enabled to be inhabited by communities. So now moving a little bit as well with connecting that with climate, we have as well to understand how the climate emergency is then not gender neutral, right? And when we're saying that this is not gender neutral, is not precisely because women or gender not conforming people have something biologically that makes them more vulnerable. And I try to as well challenge the word vulnerable into vulnerabilized, because it's not that they are just born like that, is that it has been a previous condition and we need to give responsibility to someone for that vulnerability, right? And when we said that there is the climate change is not gender neutral, we mean it from that very same root, right? On how the effects of climate change are disproportionately affecting women and gender not conforming people, and it is because of the different barriers in the access to information, to emergency calls, to finance resources, to spaces and technology transfer, and as well for enabling those dreams and those solutions that are already happening in the ground to expand, and as well uh, provide that matrix of different solutions and possibilities on the ground, right? So this is when we are saying that climate change is not gender neutral, this is what we mean. And the way as well, the work as well that we do from the Women and Gender constituency and with many different feminists in the space, now moving a little bit to connect all of this with inclusivity, is that inclusivity is only just one step. This cannot be an end on its own. It cannot be the end, because inclusivity without any type of transformative action is just not going to work. Why I'm saying this? Because when, and I quote, perhaps some folks in the room have heard this say before, and many feminists said, no, we do not want to be feminists, or women do not want to be included in a polluted stream. We want the stream to be clean. We want the stream to be sustainable, to be healthy for all. And that is the reflection that I also want to leave, because it is about it cannot, and that then is when I come back with the geopolitical context, right? It is not when governments, and particularly governments from the north, then push for the inclusion of women in false solutions and dangerous destructions such as carbon markets, right? Is not how we are introducing women into a system that is continually exploiting them. It's not about how we're going to introduce or include women into those market systems that have been putting so many barriers and that are continuing to exploit their labor. It is know how we are going to include women into a militarized system that today is devastating the world and is draining our souls. It is not about how we include women into a financial system that is so rooted in the World Bank and in the International Monetary Fund that is going to keep on perpetuating structural adjustments that are privatizing our whole territories, our lives, our time, our dreams. And this is how we need to be critical about when we advocate for inclusion, how we need to move as well beyond, how that inclusion of women is not just to be part of have a seat only. This is part of that, of course. We need to be on the table. We need quotas. We need as well the different indicators. That is for sure. I'm not, let's say, negating that part of that. But we also need to move as well beyond on which are those policies that are going to then disrupt that same system that has been excluded them, correct? So in that way, then is when we are discussing, and I hope as well to see some of those conversations sparkling after this webinar, is okay, how then from that inclusion, then we can also enable increasing, or not increasing, but strengthening, the knowledge, different forms of knowledge, how in that inclusivity conversation, then we bring as well other forms of knowledge, that perhaps are not the same academic Western notions of the world and of being in harmony with our system. How in that same inclusion we bring as well the perspective of trans, of migrants, of refugees, right, into the table, and how then we ensure that that inclusion also moves into having that distribution of power, that goes from the same spaces of decision making in the multilateral arena, in the local, in the regional space. How then we move as well that inclusion in the boards and in the different policies into those financial institutions or financial structures that do provide funding in terms of grants directly to feminist organizations, and not anymore in loans, and not anymore in those market solutions that many are promoting. Rather, how are we funding our future? How are we funding life? How are we really moving into stopping that notion of growth, the notion of accumulation, the notion of that reproduction of capital based on that unequal exchange that I was presenting at the beginning, to then think about what is needed towards that life in dignity and towards all those different challenges that we are seeing. Because climate perhaps is one big challenge that we are seeing, but also we need to widen our perspective on how we are also discussing and how we are also being affected by surpassing many of the different planetary boundaries, right? And this is where the magic starts happening as well, when we start as well framing and seeing the different connections that happen in the different forms of oppression, in the different crises, but also with the different movements, right? When we integrate conversations as well, not only with the feminists, but also with other different movements. And I think that I might be a little bit out of time, I'm not sure, but I can also stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that amazing presentation and introduction to gender and inclusivity from like a global perspective, but also interlinking the different issues. You know, that gender is not just an issue that is siloed on its own to be discussed only when in relation to gender or anything that falls under that umbrella, you know, women's empowerment, marginalized identities, but showing that kind of global link between all the issues that all the issues that are happening in the world. And I really like how you frame that in saying that including the climate emergency, and saying that the climate emergency is not gender neutral, in that I think that really kind of drives home the point that climate affects every fabric of how we are existing at the moment. And if we do not take that into consideration, then the solutions that we bring forth won't be able to really touch on all the ways that this climate emergency is being experienced at the moment. So thank you so much, and please do reach out to Gina to get more information and to engage more in terms of unpacking the intersectionality aspect of the work that we do. And I think from that, we will move on to Dr. Yaliwe Clark, who will give us a presentation on the practical framework that has come out of the feminist approach. So on to you, Doctor.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody in different parts of the world. Thank you so much, Gina, for really framing this conversation from not only a feminist, but really looking at a version of feminist decoloniality. I think it's really what you really offered us. And I appreciate that. And I was hoping you would do that so that I could go into this one piece that I'm offering the group today. And if we hold on to Gina's very deep thinking and analysis, that asks of us to think about social change from the perspective of shifting uh, um, deep structural oppressions that go back in time for us in the global south, which I think for this webinar is focused on that perspective. The structural oppression we're talking about is necessarily entangled and cannot be separated from colonial systems of oppression, right? And feminist center we're the only people who analyze decoloniality in a way that asks us to name patriarchy as a system of oppression. And when we think about it in that way, as Gina has talked about, then we cannot not talk about capitalist extractivism and how that's entangled with patriarchal notions of self, of the other, of labor systems, of economies, of the ways in which the worldviews that we hold around nature and the environment. So keeping all that in mind, what I'm offering you here is a framework that was developed by a feminist located, well, I would say lived and grew up mostly in Zambia, but whose ancestors are also located in Malawi. So this is all in southern part of Africa, what we now call the southern part of Africa. And Sarah Longway is a well-known feminist activist and organizer and thinker and writer of her time. She's still alive, and she developed this framework in the late 80s and early 90s. And I know her very well. She is my mother. So I grew up watching, understanding how it is she co-created or co-authored this framework with other feminists in the African feminist movement and also within my family. So what's interesting about this framework is that although it's not couched in the kind of decolonial feminist analysis discourse that Gina has spoken to us about, what it still offers us, and it's still very popular in women's rights organizing spaces, especially those that work along the lines of development work, and climate justice has entered that kind of thinking about social change. It was very popular in thinking about how is it that we integrate our feminist analysis in a very practical way from the lives and the stories and the realities of the people who have been excluded, right? And in this case, from a feminist perspective, it would be mostly people who are gendered as women normatively and non-normatively, and also other kinds of people on the margins of these capitalist patriarchal systems that in the global south for us are entangled with colonial systems of oppression that we're still grappling with in our imagination of the nation state, in our imagination of development. So I have a picture of Sarah Longway there and of me next to Sarah Longway when I graduated in 2022 with a PhD in social development. And you can see she's wearing my gown and my hat because a lot of my thinking, so my thesis and my work is feminist critiques of development processes, and a lot of my thinking was inspired by this framework and my mother's own ongoing feminist activist approach to social justice. So what I'm going to speak to now is the elements of this framework and how it is this framework can provide a conceptual framework. It is a conceptual framework for praxis, right? So the Longway Women's Empowerment Framework, sometimes is called the Longway Framework, is really intended to help planners, community activists question what we think what women's empowerment is, or what gender equality means in practice. And from this point, it also asks us to assess critically to what extent a development intervention is actually supporting empowerment. And if you think about this in framework, when you're looking at climate justice action, there's all these interventions about how to involve community, how to ensure that the people who are experiencing the effects of a climate injustice are integrated in a way that they're authentically articulating their perspective on what the consequences, how they're experiencing, how climate injustice is affecting their daily life, maybe access to water, maybe clean air, whatever it is. This approach would say, what is your social change methodology? Can you critically look at your social change methodology, how it is that you think you're integrating the people who are most affected, who in a negative way, the ones who are most on the margins of, in this case, this patriarchal, heteronormative, capitalist economic and social political system that is creating the kinds of climate injustice that we are facing in the world. So that's the kind of framework that it is. And Sarah Longway defines, in her case, in the 90s, the discourse was women's empowerment, right? And she says from her time of developing this framework that for her, women's empowerment was about enabling women themselves to take an equal place with men, but also for them to frame their own articulation of the injustice and what needs to happen to change that, to take control over the factors of production on an equal footing with those who own the means of production, with those who are usually and still systemically across the world, these large companies, governments that are doing this extraction. The bodies that head those institutions are masculine, male presenting bodies, right? Male, masculine presenting bodies. And so, how do we shift that dynamic? So Sarah Longway argues that at her time, much of the development literature, examined the extent to which equality between men and women had been achieved according to the conventional sectors of the economy. Again, not critiquing what is economy, as Gina was saying. What is this thing? What is this system we're asking for inclusion for people on the margins to be included in? A lot of development programs, and you can say that about climate justice action, is not asking that question deeply enough. And from this feminist framework, she's saying we need a process through which we can analyze this system of inequality, in a way that encourages people and the social movements, in this case of climate justice intersecting with feminism, to ask what is the grounded worldview of what needs to change in society? How can we enable people to make those shifts in order to change the situation of suffering? The language at the time was poverty, inequality, and all that, lack of productive resources, and that. If you could move to the next slide. Oh, before you move to the next slide, so I gave a link which I'll put in the chat, or maybe the technical team can put that link in the chat so that you can find the book. This book has only recently been published by Sarah Longway and Roy Clark. Roy Clark is a co-author and partner of Sarah Longway, also my father. So I'm speaking to the work of my parents. They have recently republished it so that it is accessible as a separate document. So it was so popular that it was integrated into international feminist development analysis and conceptual frameworks in the UN, in the United Nations, and Oxfam and other development agencies in the 90s. And so what they did was update it and give it a little bit more grounding in some of the questions we have now, but really packaged all the frameworks. I think there's up to 20 frameworks, different ways of thinking about what is empowerment. What is this deep political social change that centers feminist worldviews um, in a way that enables a praxis of social change that moves from the worldview of those who are most marginalized? And so you can find the book there and purchase it. But if you want a free access to the content, you can go to other sources. So if you could move to the next slide. Okay, so at the bottom of this page, I have a link to an Oxfam guide to gender analysis frameworks. And that's one of the places it was originally published alongside other gender analysis frameworks. So what does the Longway Women's Empowerment Framework suggest is a useful conceptual lens for this kind of deep social change praxis that moves from the realities of the people who are most affected? It draws on the thinking of Paulo Freire, who is a South American author and social activist, titled "The Pedagogy of the Oppressed." So the idea that uh, um, people who are experiencing oppression are the ones who have the most insight, the most authentic and vivid imagination of not only what is happening, the ability to articulate what's happening, but also the imagination of what the alternative would be. And so it's based on that thinking of Paulo Freire as well. And so Sarah Longway speaks about levels of equality and levels of empowerment that move from what she calls welfare, which is more like the material realities of the people on the ground, where the realities, in terms of especially access to resources. When you're thinking about typical development work, you're talking about food, water, shelter, health facilities, and so on. And the question here is, how is it that we can understand and check from the community their experience of access to resources on the ground, and not to go through and to rely on the perspectives of the development agencies, international development agencies that purport to be providing those resources. Rather, you have a grounded, community-based approach to seeking insight into the material reality of the people on the ground. And so then you engage with the community on the ground, and preferably work with community members on the ground to find out how they're experiencing access or not, no non-access, or limited access, or problematic access, or in this case with climate justice activists, you might say polluted access to these resources, and engage in a kind of dialogue process that enables the community members themselves to articulate their own interpretation of what is going on. Now, in this framework, we're talking about engaging with one set of people gendered as women, to say, never mind everyone else who is being involved in this climate justice action strategy. We want to know from those who are least likely to be consulted, least likely to have shaped the kind of climate justice action that is purportedly dealing with years of environmental degradation, and sit with community members and have a series of reflections and dialogues and discussions in which there is another layer of insight that enables the people who are on the margins themselves to think deeply and reflect on why it is they think the river is polluted. what are their perspectives, what are their realities. And that's a process of conscientization in which the people themselves realize it's nothing to do with their own histories and ways of engaging with water in the community. It actually has to do with a social political system that's not only to do with the factory up the road dumping, whatever it is in the water, polluting substance in the water, toxic substance in the water. It's got to do with the social political system that is that land was extracted. It is that they themselves as women do not have a decision making portal or sphere of influence to change it. And then they are moved quite organically to work together, collective participation to seek control over the resource or over the circumstance that they have that they see to be the source of the area that needs to be action to be changed. So really it is a framework that I would encourage you to read about, to think about, that has very practical steps as to how to engage with communities from the perspective of their worldviews and incrementally through grounded dialogue processes to facilitate collective conscientization that inspires the community to take charge of their own circumstances. And that would necessarily entail actually a mobilization strategy that is a resistance to uh, 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 very large and long-term social political change, social political oppressive systems. It's a long-term change a process that would be required. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure that there will be many examples in the presentations that will be given in the next conversations about how it is that people have worked with communities along these lines and maybe struggled with it. It's not an easy thing to facilitate, and most of us in the social justice activist world grapple with how best to work closely with communities in this way. And if we think about Palestine now, what are Palestinians themselves grappling with, and how can we work to support them in very harsh, very difficult contexts, but not move from the arrogance of our perspective of what needs to be done, but move from the perspective of what it means to be most affected by the genocide, by the war. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. That was an amazing presentation following on from Gina's presentation, just for grounding that the kind of like work we do in a practical in a tool, because a lot of the questions we get in the VCA, and it's a program, Voices for Just Climate Action, where we are aiming to amplify the voices and the solutions of people on the ground who are facing the climate challenges every day. And their experiences and voices, our experiences and voices, especially in the global south, tend to be left out of the discussion rooms, where these decisions are being made around strategies and plans and ways to get funding, for climate change. So introducing this framework, I think, is very powerful and important for us in the climate space to start thinking about how we can make our work more impactful, and also how can we try to assess that in a way that we are looking at the systems, the power structures in place, but also looking at very impactful and tangible ways to transform it in order to make room for all the people, the voices, communities that constantly get left out. So thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a question in the chat from Millie, and it reads, I would like to know if Longway women do also empower the special groups that is disabled women, because sometimes they are left behind helpless and the ones who are adversely affected by climate change. Oh, I see you've answered that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's time for maybe you want to collect a few questions. I just responded very briefly in the chat, but I'm happy to expand. Maybe you want to check in for more questions.
Yeah.
I'll be guided by you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. If there are any questions for both Gina and Dr. Eliwa Clark, please feel free to ask them, raise your hands, or even type it in the chat box, if that works out better. But then I think in the meantime, Doctor, you could you expand on your answer to Millie, please?
Yeah, so Millie, what I found is this framework can be applied to any grouping that is experiencing marginality, right? When Sarah Longway wrote it, she was really working in what was a very early articulation, of gender inequality and women's empowerment. And at that time, the question of disability rights wasn't middle center, in how it is gender inequality was articulated. So it was written at a time when many feminists globally, not only on the African continent, were describing gender equality as women's equality without delineating, without clarifying which women, where, what history, what other systems of oppression intersect with patriarchy, in so that we can have a nuanced, or what is now called a more intersectional languaging, of women's empowerment. So if you look at the discourse, in the links that I've sent you, the languaging of gender equality is really the languaging of gender equality that was considered fairly radical in the 90s, right? It didn't have a nuanced kind of framing of the different realities of women people, even if you just worked within normative femininities, people who present what in their bodily expression, what people say, oh, those are women, oh, those are disabled women, those are Black women, those are, there wasn't the framing of languaging that we have now that would ask us to think more complexly about which women were and also how gender is performed, right, in society. The framework was definitely not question, is feminist not defined as woman who thinks she's a man? Is that true? No, I wouldn't say a feminist is often defined as a woman who thinks she's a man. That would be a very distorted way of thinking about feminism. I'm going to ask Gina to step in there to explain what feminism is. I think feminism definitely is about engaging with a, a vision of society that imagines a just world. And the way we articulate that vision centers gender as an important route through which to think about justice. Gina, what do you think? How would you like to answer that question?
Yes, thank you. I would also agree with you, no, that this is not perhaps let's say a definition or how feminists see themselves. And I think that in that order of ideas and thinking as well about the different intersections that you were mentioning, it is also important, at least from what I see, that there are many different perceptions and understanding of feminism. So, for example, where I come from in Latin America, you cannot just put all feminists or all women within just one same bowl of feminism. Rather, you have feminism that are very much rooted into those fights against extractivist systems. There is as well a big feminism that emerges from more collective, communitary perspective from other indigenous work. And there are even as well so many indigenous women that perhaps do not identify as a feminist per se, but are also kind of walking in the same or in the parallel no journeys when it comes to the fight towards collective rights. So that to say that there are many different ways, but when we also see feminism, we do not see feminism from a binary perspective, in the sense of either you are a woman thinking as a man or a man thinking as a woman, or like we move as well beyond those binaries to then dive deeper and to weave among all those different connections that are perhaps I was bringing as well at the beginning, on how those realities are intersected by many different identities, by many different layers of oppression. And when we think as well about feminism, how we can think as well, there are many feminisms. So I also like to quote a sister that I admire a lot, from Mexico, Emilia, and is when she said that we are perhaps not we're feminists of some of us are feminists of disruption. No, when thinking about that, the structural analysis on how our work goes beyond as well just the individual identity, but it sees as well the macro perspective of how all those different systems in which our economies and our dreams are kind of grounded, then how can we deconstruct and push for something that is different, push for something that is as well being framed in many of our communities, moving as well away from only advocating for individual rights, no, because that advocacy towards individual rights or that individual freedom is very capitalist, but how we move into that collective thinking, and how then we see as well, for example, crises such as the climate crisis, the health crisis, the economic crisis, as something that affects us, the collective, no? And when we think about the rights, what does that mean? Yeah, I could stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angina, in answering that question. I think, oh, we just have a comment saying, hello, everyone. This is Anawana. Enjoying this and hope to see a community full of gender equality, for this will foster a true sense of belonging and purpose. Thank you so much for that comment. And just to add on to what both of you communicated around that question on it's a woman, is feminism often defined as a woman who thinks that she's a man? And I think that is a very important question that you've posed, Justine, because I think even with the framework, Dr. Clark, that you have presented to us, and the frameworks that we will discuss, I think the power of these frameworks is that they give us the tools to unearth these kinds of thinking and these questions, and to find ways to transform the thinking, to transform how people engage around the work that we do, any justice work, whether it's climate justice or just social justice work in general. And I think that a lot of engaging with this kind of work opens us up to a lot of challenges. It opens up to a lot of different perceptions that might not always be correct. But it also gives us the opportunity to engage with those understandings and find ways to make a difference and an impact where everybody's lives are taken into consideration in the different ways that they exist. So yeah, I just want to check if there are any more questions. I see here Justine has another question. The pillars of empowerment are cooperation, collaboration, technology, and knowledge. How are these pillars related to the Longwe Women's Empowerment Framework?
Yeah, so is there time to speak to this, Liseko?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so central to the women's empowerment framework is collectivity, and collaboration. So definitely the idea of empowerment that the conceptual framework is offering is that empowerment is not possible without collective organizing, and not just, oh, let's meet on Sunday and we'll give you a workshop. No, the people who are experiencing the problem themselves frame the workshop because they have identified that there's a problem. Do you see what I mean? And if the community is not aware of the problem, then a level of political awareness, a feminist political awareness in this case, would be that kind of education that enables a spark in the community to say, yes, I get it now. I get that this is a deep structural problem. And only through layered processes of collective mobilization for change will this shift. So it's at the heart of the framework. Cooperation and collaboration is at the heart of the framework. And I can say knowledge is at the heart of the framework when we think of what the framework is saying the process of conscientization is, borrowing from Paulo Freire. So it's a kind of, in fact, let me just read from the framework how conscientization is defined, and you'll understand how, just to be clear. So yes, conscientization in this framework means the process of becoming aware of the extent to which problems arise, not so much from from an individual's inadequacies, but rather from the systemic discrimination against the social group, which puts all members of the group at a disadvantage. In women's empowerment, conscientization therefore involves the process by which women collectively analyze and understand the gender discrimination which they are up against. This is the basis for action to overcome and dismantle the obstacles which have been holding them back. So in the women's empowerment framework, the longer women's empowerment framework, women's conscientization is seen as a very crucial step. And that's a step that requires a shift in how we understand what knowledge is. You know, it's not going to be what you get from a book, a textbook. It's about knowledge emanating from collective reflection on a problem, and then a realization that this is actually this is something I cannot deal with myself. I'm not going to be able to get clean water on my own, no matter how much I try. And that's got to do with systemic oppression that marginalizes me as a woman and people in this community, XXX, and so on and so on. With regards to technology, maybe the context in which this process of empowerment is happening requires knowledge of technology, possibly. I'm not sure what Justin Mwanje means by technology, but that depends on the context. My understanding of how technology would come into how we use the Women's Empowerment Framework.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Clark. We'll use that to end this Q&A session and move on to our next presentation, which will be giving us a global perspective within the VCA of gender and social inclusion within the global UNFCCC processes. And that presentation will be given by Faith Munya from Akina Mamawa, Africa. So Faith, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leseko. It's been nice putting this first together. And thank you so much to Gina and Dr. Yaliwe for helping to sort of frame the beginning of our conversation. I don't know if my video is on. And if you can hear me, can you hear me well?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, great. All right, so I'm going to share with us the VCA global perspective. It won't be as extensive as it is, but I'll try and touch on a number of the things that we've basically been advancing from a gender perspective. And there was an image that I had requested Lesego to put up. I don't know if you're going to be able to put it up. But maybe as you try and work with the technology, I just wanted to start off by sharing my own reflections on some of the questions that were asked. And I think for me, if I was asked what feminism is about, I would say that it's about seeing those who have been or those whose realities continue to be erased or have been erased and invisibilized by systems and structures of oppression. And we know, for example, that patriarchy does that, colonialism does that, neoliberal capitalism does that. It erases and invisibilizes certain individuals, the contribution of certain individuals. So for example, the unpaid care work provided by women has for a long time been invisibilized, right from the colonial era. And then now with neoliberal capitalism at play. And so for me, feminism is the frame that allows me to begin and allows a lot of people who have come to it and have adopted it to be able to see those whose realities, whose contribution, who as individuals have been erased or have been invisibilized. It's also about challenging and transforming those systems and structures that have allowed for this invisibilization to continue, but also inequality generally to persist. So yeah, I think for me, that's how I would respond to that particular question. So I wanted us to just start by reflecting on this particular quote, which is by, sorry, the name got erased for some reason, but she's part of the Women and Gender constituency. She's a Nigerian woman who is part of the Women and Gender constituency. I'll drop her name in the chat later. But one of the things that she says is that one way to achieve a just, human-centered negotiation outcome is to meaningfully engage marginalized groups. After all, what is justice without recognizing and endorsing the unique struggles of members of our diverse communities? And so as I begin to share part of what, as the VCA, part of the work that has been happening, some of which some of you have been involved in, but also been leading, is really based on the recognition that existing climate governance does not adequately support inclusivity, does not adequately support the amplification and recognition of the contribution that women and other marginalized groups make or bring to that space. On the contrary, we see that as the climate crisis worsens, civic space continues to shrink. So the voices of local people, particularly women, are rarely heard when it comes to decision making. And I would like to put decision making in bold because later on I'll be sharing some of the statistics of participation of women, particularly within the UNFCCC space, specifically COP and the intersessional sessions. And you realize why I'm putting climate decision making in bold. So we see that these are the groups that are at the front line of the climate crisis. They are also at the front line of designing and advancing and preserving different kinds of sustainable climate solutions. And yet they continue to not be recognized, they continue to not be heard, they continue to not have sufficient space at the table. So when you look at the statistics around participation, and obviously us as feminists, like Gina already mentioned, we also continue to question the idea of merely analyzing progress around gender equality on the basis of how many women are participating in these spaces, because we also acknowledge that these spaces are also anchored in a system that is not working. So it doesn't matter how many women are brought into that space. If we do not transform the ideologies and the values and the narratives and visions of why these systems are in place, then we will not be able to actually achieve true gender equality. But one of the things that we also recognize is that participation is one of the first steps towards transformation. And so there is within the global framing a mechanism that has been put in place and continues to be facilitated, for example, by the Women and Gender Constituency around the gender tracker, which basically takes stock of women's participation. And so when you look at the tracker right now, one of the things that it highlights is that when it came to COP28, for example, we had about 34 women representing their, as part of their party delegation. And the highest number of women delegates we have seen until today is less than 50%. So we are talking about 48%. And from the statistics provided, one of the things that remains clear is that there are more women who are attending the quote-unquote technical space, so the intersessional discussions that happen, particularly at Bonn. So if you're familiar with the negotiations that happen at Bonn, which are more technical, there are more women engaging. But then when it comes to the political space, which is the COP, where a lot of the decisions are taken, there are fewer and fewer women participating. And this is why I put the idea of climate decision making in bold, because being able to get onto the decision making table is influenced by a number of factors. And it's also determined by, for example, how our political decision making is determined at national level. As we all know, for example, in a lot of our countries, who gets to join the government delegation is to a larger extent a political decision. And recently in May, we hosted one of our African Women's Leadership Institute, and this particular one brought together gender focal points from different countries, from different countries across the continent. And we were shocked that when one of the gender focal points shared that she had never attended a COP despite being the gender focal point person. And this had nothing to do with the fact that she didn't have facilitation, whether it's in terms of ticket or per diem. All those were available and have been available, but for some reason she just doesn't get to be selected to be part of the party delegations. And so that basically shows you the power dynamics at play and some of the things that influence the extent to which women get to represent their countries as part of the party delegation. And so I think even when it comes to participation, it's important that we are not only interrogating it at the global level when the COP happens or when the Bonn meetings happen, but that we are also challenging our governments to be able to bring more women on board, but also even challenging them to have them as head of delegations. And from the statistics, another thing that is highlighted is that since 2008 until today, there has not been a woman head of delegation in any of the countries. And that shows you how far we are when it comes to even addressing just the initial aspects of achieving gender equality. So the current gap within the national, regional, and the global climate governance discourse around participation when it comes to influencing climate change policies requires that we are interrogating the power structures and also being able to influence and shift them. So part of what as the VCA we seek to do or have sought to do since the program started is to try and contribute towards shifting power, but also shifting resources. So shifting power when it comes to decision making, but also shifting resources when it comes to allocating resources to solutions that are led by women, solutions that are led and designed by communities, and recognizing the different diversities. And that's why the aspect of intersectionality, as was earlier shared, is very critical and is also an important part of the work that that VCA does when it comes to advancing gender justice. So our goal is to be able to amplify voices and diverse voices. So when we talk about voices, we are, and like I said, adopting the intersectional aspect and recognizing that women are not a homogeneous group, and like was shared by one of the participants earlier, there are women who are differently abled, there are women of color, there are women who gender non-conforming, there are women who who live in rural areas and those that live in urban areas, and even within the urban areas, there are women who are more privileged to be living in more wealthier urban centers, and then there are those who live in what is referred to as the poor the urban settlements. And so having that lens of intersectionality is very, very critical, because then it ensures that that we are not only focusing on those that are privileged, because even when it comes to because if we do that, then we are reinforcing exclusion, but also we are contributing towards maintaining the status quo of inequality and unfair redistribution of resources, but also, like Gina said earlier, the issues around unequal exchange. And so our work has also focused on being able to contribute towards implementing commitments that have been made within the UNFCCC as part of, for example, the Paris Agreement. So if you've been engaging around the gender justice work within the context of climate change governance and policy work, you know about the Lima Work Program and the Gender Action Plan. And implementation of this particular framework, despite a number of its gaps, because if I'm to highlight, for example, one of the critical gaps is that it doesn't refer or provide for sexual reproductive health and rights. And yet, when it comes to evaluating progress that has been made and holding countries accountable to around the work of gender equality, this is the framework that guides the evaluation process. So if critical aspects like sexual reproductive health and rights have not been captured, it means that accountability in that regard will not be undertaken. But nonetheless, it's one of the frameworks that that is referred to, and it also provides grounding for example, sorry, I'm failing to get the word, requiring countries to put in place national climate change gender action plans, but also integrating gender within their national adaptation plans. So, for example, countries like Zambia have gender action plans that they have developed. And one of the concerns that has been raised by a number of African countries is that these plans remain underfunded. And so within the work of, for example, the Green Climate Fund, one of the things that we have been advancing is that there is need for the Green Climate Fund, which is GCF, to make specific financial commitment towards financing gender action plans. And so this is also part of the work that you can continue to amplify as part of efforts to integrate gender across climate action. We also know, for example, that the Beijing platform for action is also a critical framework as part of the global commitments and global work around achieving gender equality. Although at that time when it was framed, climate change was not a very major global concern, or it had not been recognized as a major global concern. So there was no specific commitment provided. A lot of it was really mainstream. So these are some of the things that need to be amplified, especially now as we are in the process of rethinking and reviewing and strengthening the Beijing platform of action. So as I try to conclude, I think one of the things that I would emphasize is that so many times when we work at the global level for organizations that find themselves working a lot at the global level, there's often there's often limitations in terms of ensuring that we are connecting rural and community livelihoods and experiences to global decision-making spaces. And I think that's one of the values that then as a VCA, we bring on board, that there's an emphasis on connecting rural and community livelihoods and experiences, so that then we can be able to ensure that there's integration of gender, but also broadly the feminist approach within climate policy and action at the global level, but also emphasis around human rights. And I think this is an important framing that must be adopted in the work around gender, because it also allows us to be contextual and applicable when it comes to the different communities with which we work, because they are home, particularly in the global south, because it's home to the most marginalized. And I think my final remarks would be around strongly challenging extractive and exploitative and patriarchal and capitalist economic models and systems, because the climate crisis is a result of failed economic systems. And so we need to hold corporations accountable. We need to challenge, particularly the global north, to be able to strengthen accountability when it comes to response to women's rights and human rights in the ways in which they do business, in the ways in which they do consumption, in the ways in which they do production. So reflecting on even the solutions that we are advancing. And one of the things that we've been emphasizing is the need for us to center our indigenous solutions. So within the work around seed systems, we see different activists getting lost in the ideas around improved seed varieties, and yet there's a risk that then presents when it comes to losing out on our sovereignty and our control around seed systems and agricultural sector in general. So I think for me, it's to just emphasize the idea of consciousness, being conscious about, for example, some of the solutions that you're advancing, and constantly questioning whether you are centering the most marginalized, and if you are contributing towards addressing inequality and addressing marginalization as opposed to reinforcing it. Thank you very much, and over to you. I think I went over time. Apologies.
Thank you, Faith. Thank you. No worries. I think it is important for us to ground all the information that we are sharing around gender and the frameworks in the work that we are doing in VCA, which is both trying to tackle it at the global level and the local level to bridge that gap and the tension that often arises when we're trying to do a lot of advocacy and mobilization work around climate justice within the global south, and trying to connect our issues and our solutions and voices to the global level. So thank you so much for grounding us in the VCA perspective and the work that we are doing and are intending to continue to do. And with that, I will move on to Maria Jose, who's going to give us more of a national perspective of the GESI work that we do in Latin America. Thank you so much, Maria. Over to you.
Thank you, Lisego. I will be speaking, and can I wait for the slide to come? Well, I'm very happy to be with you today. I will be speaking in Spanish, so please look for the icon in the bottom of your screen while we're waiting for the slides to change. I'm still seeing the last slide from our colleague.
Sorry, 1 second. We are just switching sharing rights.
Okay. So I will be speaking about how we are incorporating GESI framework into the ground on our work in the ground in one specific region, which is the Chaco region. So whenever we are ready, I will start. And you can go directly to the second slide. Thank you. Gracias. Buenos días a todos, a todas. Elijo hablar en español porque, como decimos en el territorio, la lengua y escucharnos en nuestra lengua es el primer paso para la inclusión. Entonces, para poder empezar a hablar de lo que hacemos en BAC en el territorio, es importante poder estar o entender en dónde estamos. Voy a presentar dos ejemplos desde la región del Chaco. La ecorregión del Chaco es una vasta ecorregión de más de 1 millón de kilómetros cuadrados que se extiende entre los países de Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia y una pequeña extensión del territorio también en Brasil. Siguiente slide. The next one, please. La región del Chaco es una región de extremos. Tiene es una zona sumamente árida, pero también está confinada por dos grandes ríos. Entonces hay extremos de sequía, pero también hay extremos de inundación. Y es una región con muchos problemas de comunicación, con muchos problemas de comunidades aisladas en esa región. Siguiente slide. Next one, please. Entonces, hoy voy a hablarle específicamente de dos ejemplos de cómo estamos nosotros trabajando el tema de género e inclusión en el territorio. Para esto empezamos con lo que decía Yaligüe, de conocer cuáles son las organizaciones que están trabajando en el territorio. Es decir, nosotros no invitamos a talleres, nosotros conversamos con las organizaciones y los movimientos que ya existen en el territorio y que vienen trabajando desde hace muchos años. Uno de estos movimientos, una de estas redes, es la red llamada el Colectivo de Mujeres del Gran Chaco. El colectivo de mujeres del Gran Chaco es una red de mujeres que incluye mujeres rurales, indígenas, pero también incluye mujeres urbanas y academia. Entonces es una red muy diversa que funciona en 3 países, en Paraguay, en Argentina y en Bolivia. Con esta red hemos trabajado principalmente en estas líneas que ustedes pueden ver en el slide. Inclusión digital. Como decía al inicio, la región del Chaco es muy extensa y tiene el problema del acceso a las comunidades. Entonces tienden las comunidades a excluirse. Desde el colectivo de mujeres, hace varios años se viene trabajando en telecentros. Telecentros son pequeños espacios comunitarios donde se ha conseguido poder tener internet para que las mujeres desarrollen sus actividades. Desde BAC lo que hicimos fue fortalecer esos telecentros en 2 países, en Paraguay y en Bolivia. Otra de las áreas son las mentorías colaborativas. El colectivo de mujeres desarrolló una estrategia de mentorías colaborativas donde sus propios miembros, o sea, las mujeres que son parte de la red, desarrollan las mentorías. Esto lo que hace es fortalecer el vínculo entre sus miembros y también ayuda a crear ese proceso de colaboración tan importante que también fue mencionada por Peliwe anteriormente. Otra de las líneas es el trabajo relativo a todo lo que tenga que ver con lobby y advocacy. Para esto trabajamos sobre los temas que son más importantes para las mujeres en cada una de sus comunidades. Es decir, miramos aquellas luchas que ya se están dando en las comunidades y encontramos las relaciones de esos procesos y las implicancias que el cambio climático podría tener sobre esos procesos. Y por último, y en realidad esta es una línea transversal, el colectivo de mujeres busca crear espacios seguros para el trabajo de las mujeres. Esa es una premisa en el trabajo del colectivo. Otro de los ejemplos de los que voy a hablar es ya un ejemplo local, es la articulación de mujeres indígenas del Paraguay. Esta articulación de mujeres se, se viene trabajando desde hace más de 10 años. Es una articulación de mujeres indígenas, líderes indígenas, que desde hace más de 10 años vienen trabajando juntas. Lo que hicimos con BAC es identificar con esta articulación cuáles eran los pasos que se tenían que dar en este proceso que las mujeres de esta agrupación tenían. Y el paso que ellas mismas identificaron fue la formalización de su organización. Entonces, el primer paso o la primera acción que hicimos desde BAC con esta articulación fue seguir todos los pasos para la formalización de la organización. Hoy, la articulación de mujeres indígenas del Paraguay está formalizada ante la ley en el país y tiene, mediante esta formalización, acceso a espacios de discusión que antes no tenía. Entonces, para nosotros, eso fue realmente un hito. También trabajamos la construcción de capacidades para los procesos de advocacy y aquí se trabajó muchísimo con las mujeres el tema de las vocerías, es decir, poder preparar a las mujeres líderes de la articulación para que hagan su voz escuchar en los medios, para que puedan seguir también ciertos sistemas de comunicación más efectiva, ¿verdad? Entonces, estos dos son ejemplos que estamos teniendo en el territorio desde BAC. Yo lo que quiero acentuar con estos dos ejemplos es que trabajamos fundamentalmente desde las bases que nos dan las organizaciones de mujeres que ya están constituidas. Y creo que eso es el paso fundamental, es decir, mirar lo que ya existe en el territorio, fortalecer lo que ya existe en el territorio y trabajar sobre las líneas que son principales para las mujeres que están organizadas en el territorio. Los dos slides que siguen, the next two slides, los dos slides que siguen son informaciones sobre estas dos agrupaciones. Sorry. Entonces, ahí tienen información. Eso va a quedar en la presentación por si lo quieren ver. Y no quiero robar más tiempo porque creo que estamos muy sobre la hora, pero sí quiero terminar diciendo algo que siempre decimos en el grupo de mujeres con el que trabajamos. El pesimismo es un lujo que no nos podemos dar. Y creo que eso es algo que hoy más que nunca, después de las elecciones en Estados Unidos, tenemos que tener presente. No podemos ser pesimistas, tenemos que mirar realmente de manera positiva lo que se ha construido. De lo contrario, también caemos en la desilusión, ¿verdad? Entonces, en estos grupos de apoyo que tenemos con las mujeres, uno de los factores principales es el cuidado. Y en ese cuidado está también el traer alegría y que esa reflexión sea siempre con alegría. Bueno, no sé si tengo todavía tiempo, pero no quiero robar más tiempo porque creo que tenía 5 minutos. Entonces, muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Maria Jose, for that lovely presentation. You can still a few more minutes if you would like to continue, but I can also hand over to our next speaker. Yeah, okay. So I'll hand over to our next speaker. Oh, Maria, you want to speak?
No, I think I'm okay. If you have any questions about these two activities that I choose two of the ones that we are working in the field, please just put it in the chat and I will try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will move on to our next speaker from Amwa, who's going to give us an introduction into feminist PMAL or meal and storytelling. So Sarah, you can go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Lesego. And I want to appreciate Gina, Dr. Yaliwe, Faith, and Maria for the brilliant and insightful presentations, and also for creating ground for me to have this conversation on feminist email. Oftentimes when people hear the word meal, they think it's very technical, they think it's for a particular group of people. And with this conversation, I want to demystify that. And with the word feminist attached to it, we all know that all these things don't exist in a vacuum. And like Yaliwe, Dr. Yaliwe and Gina mentioned, feminism is an ideology that must be understood and adopted to if you want to see social transformations. And we are aware that M&E helps us measure the changes or give us light to the changes that we want to see. So there is no way we can measure that change without an ideological lens that seeks to distract the way certain things are, that seeks to provide alternatives that challenge the existing unequal power relations, and as well challenge the injustices that the previous speakers have also talked about. Next steps. Next slide, please. So as I believe it's very important for us to situate this conversation and understand why it's important for us to appreciate meal or PML from a feminist perspective. And PML is planning, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Most of us got accustomed to the meal culture through funding, through the projects that we implement within our organizations, through the demands that come through that the meal teams within the different organizations have to adhere to. So meal has been conceptualized from a philanthropy side, from a need from the philanthropies. So that's why currently it is developed, or it is framed in a way that mirrors the realities of the global north, or the expectations of where money is coming from, as opposed to meeting the realities of the organizations in the global south. I want us to not to separate this conversation of M&E from philanthropy and the need to decolonize philanthropy generally. And it was interesting for me to read that one of the ways in which colonial legacies needed to be sustained in Africa, or in the different countries where colonialism happened, was through development aid and through the work of international organizations. I can't share that piece of writing. So, and we are seeing this manifestation. If international organizations were one way to sustain coloniality, no wonder some of the approaches, some of the methodologies like M&E that we use in our organizations are still entrenched in those power structures that are unquestionable, that are one-sided, that seek to uphold a certain status quo, as opposed to be ingrained in the realities of the people that the different organizations intend to serve. So there's also that reality of organizations being unaware that they are perpetuating coloniality in the ways that we do our work, and meal is one of those ways in which this has been sustained. And from my 10 years of experience doing M&E work across different areas, both service delivery, advocacy, across international development agencies and organizations, and now within the feminist ecosystem, I have realized that even as the bearers of the practitioners of M&E, have failed to redefine our role in a way that does not exacerbate inequalities. We have positioned ourselves as people that cannot be questioned, because what we are doing is dealing with facts and truths that have been defined. So as for the male people that are here, all of us that interact with this concept of M&E, we need to have that awareness that nothing is written in blue and white. There's always a blurriness in between that gives room for questioning, that gives room for us to appreciate the different lenses that people have on a particular area. So a need for us to reconstruct the role of male and the people that actually do these roles within the organizations, and why it's actually existing in our organizations and in the work that we do. Next slide, please. Next, okay. Yeah, I've talked about M&E being linked to philanthropy, being linked to the work within organizations, but I want us to now start thinking with a different lens. Oftentimes, certain methodologies, certain approaches are brought, certain approaches are adopted without a deep thinking of our history, without us thinking critically on how things used to be done before we adopted the Western-centric way of doing them that came with colonialism and now manifesting through neoliberalism and all the different systems of oppression that Faith talked about. But I want us to understand that this concept of M&E has existed as old as humankind has been on this planet Earth. And in ancient Egypt, it was M&E was conducted through the things that people would relate with: the counting of grains, the weighing of livestock to understand the country's economy and GDP. We can argue that technology has helped us improve this and make the system easier. But the feminist economists will question that on how we're actually measuring our country's growth through the GDP model. So it is for us to know that the concept of meal is not new. It was in existence even here in Africa, and I believe in Latin America. Our parents used to, great-grandparents, and even our parents now, used to measure the growth of a child using beads, waist beads around the waist. Well, if the child gains weight, then they know the child is growing well, the beads will become tighter. Or, when they can reach a certain tree branch, then they are growing and their growth trajectory is good. So that is monitoring, that is evaluation, that is a practice that used to happen within our day-to-day, and it was embedded in our day-to-day realities attached to humans. Right now, when we talk about M&E, people quickly go to data. Oh, what do the numbers look like? What percentages? If you talk about meal or measurements and you don't talk about data, then probably that's not a good M&E report. That's not a good research report. So I want us to understand that what we are talking about today is technical, yes, but it can be technical in an indigenous way if that exists, because this knowledge is there, it has existed, and we have used different ways of doing M&E. So with this understanding, next slide, please. We want now to talk about why M&E was introduced the way it was introduced before now we get to the feminist way or the feminist understanding of meal and how it should be done. One, currently, in the current context, everyone has different interests from M&E. The first is, well, funding partners look for outcomes, efficiency and effectiveness of the different programs, and how this can be replicable across the different contexts. We can say yes, because, people want to taste for value for money. People want to see what they are doing, resulting into tangible results and causing impact. But of course, we can question the impact, because if that outcome is not based on the outcome that the people the program was intended to serve, but based on the expected outcome of the funding partner, then that's where we get this wrong. And in most cases, because we don't get time to involve the voices that have oftentimes been marginalized, then we end up with outcomes that are very exciting for us as funding partners, for us as implementing organizations. But when we go down to the people, to the African women, girls in their diversities, to the persons with disability, to all the groups that have been silenced, these outcomes do not necessarily make sense. And for us implementing organizations, of course, we are always running. Are we implementing? Are we moving with our work plans? Have we done A, B, C, D? What is the burn rate like? Do we see any changes? And we rarely sit down and reflect, what does this change mean to us as practitioners? What does this change mean to the people that we intend to serve? And of course, the people that we intend to serve, oftentimes in the current meal ecosystem trajectory, they're used as sources of information. You go pick information baseline, you go pick information in midlife, and yeah, we are going to pick information at end term. And with VC, I know that end term is in the pipeline. Hope this presentation sits well with all of us to approach the process differently. Next slide, please. So when we think about feminist approaches to M&E and what the current, vis-a-vis what the current practice is, one, we are dealing with a lot of standardization of meal, that is ignoring intersectionality, undermining contextual factors. So with feminist M&E, we recognize that change is nonlinear and social transformation is nonlinear and very complex. So we do not use standard measures of success, but rather we use a framework that guides on how to interrogate the existing gender stereotypes, that interrogates the power dynamics that will affect the change, that interrogates the intersecting factors that are either going to enable or disenable achieving certain results. And also we are mindful of the context in which we are operating in, or in which the different programs are being implemented. I want to share an example. In 2018, we ran a project. This project was running in Africa and also in Asia, and we had standard indicators across. So because we were mindful of the numbers, but not mindful of the context, we ran this research, which was cross-sectional with implementation for over 4 years. And in the 4th year, we started getting negative gains in Africa particularly, but not in Asia. So we wondered why in the 4th year, when we thought things would be flowery and results looking good, we are getting negative gains. And in Asia, everything was moving on as expected. And in hindsight, after interacting the concept of feminist male, I realized that, oh, well, possible explanation to that one could have been contextual factors that ignored issues of socialization, issues of culture, issues of belief systems, issues of seasons, because some of our interventions are affected by seasons, weather patterns, or cultural ceremonies and events that go on within different contexts. So we realize that within a particular year, in some of the countries in Africa, there were ceremonies, events, and activities that deeply affected the results that we got. But at that point, we were just looking at the numbers, negative, the others have positive. So standardization is not something that we consider in M&E. And this does not mean that we don't have indicators. No, we do have indicators, but we are mindful of how these are crafted to ensure that critical issues are interrogated and not forgotten. In the mainstream or conventional M&E, we are driven by results, centering organizational priorities and looking at results in the lens of how do we position ourselves? How does this make us visible to maybe attract more funding? And all of us in this development sector somehow get swapped up in that run for the next grant. But with feminist M&E, the human where change is expected is centered, not necessarily the interest of the organization. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I've talked about this, that feminist male understands that change is nonlinear, complex and nonlinear, and we also think differently on what is considered evidence. Oftentimes, we as M&E people challenge what is right, or we have a right and a truth in terms of data, in terms of evidence, because we have those data standards of validity, reliability, quality, which was set based on someone's understanding of knowledge and what research should be. But under feminist M&E, every reality counts as evidence. So we challenge how evidence is also captured, on who gives this evidence. We have so many tools that have been developed, that rapid participatory appraisals that seem very glossy on the outside, but when we go to apply them in the field, I'll give an example in Zambia. You got to apply a tool in the field, and the opinion leaders, they will tell you that we are going to use a focus group discussion or a participatory approach, and we are going to get opinion leaders. You get there, and the opinion leaders are people that have always gotten opportunities to speak. So people look at them as opinion leaders because they have had chance to voice their concerns, have always been given a space on the table. And certain people that have not been considered, who are most times women, of a lower social class, as they are termed, no one knows. And yet when you insist to speak to them, there's a wealth of wisdom that is premised on realities, on the truths and issues that need to be tackled for us to achieve systematic change. So in there are issues of power that we do interrogate and challenge, issues of control and access. When we are developing indicators under feminist M&E, it's not enough to assess or to track access and availability, but it's also important to assess issues around control because you're going to interrogate power. And I know under VCA, we use the outcome harvesting model, which is a very good model in tracking incremental change, tracking issues like backlash and the rest. But as we are looking at those outcomes, from a feminist perspective, it's important to also look at along the power spectrum. How are these outcomes? Are we having outcomes that are promoting power within? Are we building power too amongst our partners? Are we seeing aspects of power over in this advocacy? How are people using power under within these outcomes, so that we don't stop at celebrating outcomes, but we go deeply into interrogating whether we are dismantling the existing power imbalances, even with a change that we are trying to create. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through them. I know time. I think I've talked about this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. So I know time is not our greatest ally, so I will just go quickly to how bullets on how we can actually apply this within VCA, because I know that one of our first approaches as VCA is mutual collaboration, and the other one is amplifying agenda setting and amplifying the voices of citizens. But I know we are at a critical time of evaluating our program and what we have been able to achieve over the past 4 years. So one, I want us to take away that feminist meal is not an event, it's a process, and it starts with our value system as people that are involved in this process. We need to clarify the values that we want to run with. And if we have values of inclusivity, values of intersectionality, values of solidarity, of collectiveness, then those are values that we should embody throughout our M&E process. Someone cannot say that, oh, I have this M&E tool, it is feminist. No, you can have a tool that has that meets all the inclusion criteria, but when you go to apply it, you apply it in a way that is going to exacerbate injustices or power imbalances. Then feminist male is an integral part of social transformation. I think that was social transformation was clearly explained and articulated by Gina and Dr. Ayaya. Then feminist male shifts power to participants in evaluation and processes. Oftentimes, as people that are running projects, people are managing these processes, we think we are the alpha and omega. But with feminist male, we take a back seat and allow the people that we intend to serve guide the process, take charge of the process, own it collectively to be able to create the change that they would love to see. Then feminist male practitioners are not all-knowing. I've mentioned that. We do not know, and knowledge is out there. Oftentimes we disregard it and think that our knowledge and our reality is the true reality, but when actually the reality is out there. And feminist male values collective knowledge generation and context driven. And I'll explain this from the angle of when we collect knowledge from information from the field and different places, we oftentimes own it as the owners of this information and don't recognize the people that have actually authored this knowledge, that own it authentically. So this is something that all of us should look into, to recognize the true owners of the knowledge that we report in the different aspects. And it's rooted in its intersectionality. As we do our work, as we do our programming, we need to remember that we don't live single issue lives. I can be Sarah, I may have a disability, I may be a woman. So at some point, all those intersecting factors come together. We were in Zambia last year and visiting a community around River Rufunsa, talking about silting, and in the middle, a fire broke out. There's a forest fire. So we imagine the intersecting issues that these people are dealing with their own identities that intersect with these issues. So as we are doing programming and M&E, it is not important to go and tick a box of, 8 women were involved in the program, but how are they situated in that area? What context are they applying in, and what intersecting issues and identities are they battling? Then feminist male is rooted in safe programming, guided by no harm, safeguarding, ethical considerations, and all the rest. Finally, yeah, this is just to live for all of us. That meal is political, and it's all of us coming to this space with our own biases, with our own beliefs, and our own socialization. So as practitioners, not only male people, but also all of us as we do this work, we need to constantly question. We need to constantly interrogate our own biases so that we don't approach processes from our own points of knowing, but from the point of the true reality of the people and the context that we are going to serve in. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I know you were trying to package all of that very nicely in a few minutes, which you did touch on quite a bit. So please, everyone who has joined, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can try to engage more on this topic. We will be releasing a short survey at the end, not at the end of this session, but in our post-comms emails. So thank you so much, Sarah, for that. And I think we can quickly go into the gender audit tool that Trisha will be presenting as an example of the feminist PML that Sarah was touching on. So thank you so much, Sarah. And Trisha, I think you can go ahead with the presentation. We will try to get the slides up on our side as well.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. I don't know if I should wait for you to put up the slides.
Yeah, if you could, that would be.
Yes, you can take over.
Yeah. Let me make you.
Okay. Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining in from, and good evening. I'm Precious Trisha Avoli, and I'll be looking at the gender audit tool, an example of just like Sarah had mentioned, an example of feminist PML. So just to begin with, what is a gender audit tool? And briefly, just to answer this, is that this is it is a tool that essentially is a social inspection that assesses the extent to which gender equality or justice is effectively institutionalized in policies. And in our policies in organizations, the programs that we do, the structures and systems that we have in our different organizations, and how then decision-making looks like in the different organizations, but also how we allocate funding to the specific programs and projects that we do. So it is essentially just a tool that helps us foster accountability, but also helps us to constantly critique how gender responsive our policies are to for planning and evaluation purposes. So in brief, that is what the gender audit tool is. So I'll move forward to then answer the question of why a gender audit tool and why this is very important for feminist PML. So, and to do this, I'll give the example of the example of, sorry, I think I moved fast. A minute. The example of VCA and what VCA really stands for. So I'll be using VCA as a great example for why the gender audit tool and the gender audit tool that we have under the VCA. So the VCA essentially works at ensuring that voices of women and gender marginalized persons, that their narratives and their knowledge is the center of the climate discourse, and that as we fight for climate justice, as we fight for climate action, we need to center the voices of the marginalized groups. So the gender audit tool is a tool that then is adopted to then bring in the angle of feminist approaches and gender responsive approaches to assess progress done and to enable us to advocate for inclusion, engagement and participation of women and marginalized groups in creating and centering really knowledge around climate change and climate justice, as well as gender justice. So the purpose of the tool is really to enable us, like Sarah mentioned in her presentation, to give a feminist intersectional approach lens in addressing systematic inequalities of gender, race. Like Gina mentioned in her presentation, that the climate crisis is not one that is isolated or one that really just like a one-off thing that is only caused by one particular cause, but that there are all these systems of oppression that really work towards rehabilitating the climate crisis and making it continuously go on. And for us
This
to
thing
then,
is even very expensive now. You're wasting, you are apart from wasting.
sorry about that. And for us to then address the climate crisis, we need to address all the systems of oppression that then contribute to the existing crises that have been in place that continue to contribute to this to the climate crisis as is now. So the overall approach of the audit tool really is that, sorry, I'm having internet troubles. So essentially the audit tool then is a layout that then makes it useful, that is like a useful companion for undertaking thorough gender assessment to evaluate and reform our services to better promote gender equalities in our work, in our programs, and in the projects that we are running. And the actions that are made in response to the knowledge and information that a gender assessment produces is to gauge the exercise of our gender transformative policies to ensure that we are doing gender just work and not just merely doing climate action work, and essentially centering the voices of the marginalized, because like Sarah mentioned, indigenous knowledge is very important for us if we are to fight the climate crisis. So that is why we do need the gender audit tool. So the objectives of the tool, the gender audit tool as is now, the objectives are 5. And one of the first objective is to generate understanding to the extent to which feminist intersectional gender transformative approaches have been integrated in our programs. So internalized and acted upon by the Alliance and local partners in implementing the VCA program. And then 2 is to assess the VCA program's performance on gender responsiveness and with a view to strengthen existing efforts within the Alliance and seek to benchmark them across the Alliance. So beyond the Alliance, how do we then benchmark these approaches that we have been doing that are gender responsive to make it a learning point for then other people that are within the projects. Then 3, it is to assess the level of resources allocated 2 and spent on gender integration and activities aimed at achieving gender equality. So in terms of our funding, how much funding are we allocating towards gender justice as we do the climate action work? And 4 is to examine the extent to which organizational, internal, and external policies and strategies are gender responsive. So it's not just an internal tool, it is a tool that can be used both internally and externally. And I'll be hinting on that under the methodology of the audit tool. And lastly, it is to identify the room of improvement and share best practices with others on how gender transformative approaches have worked within the VCA program. So what is needed in place to conduct a gender audit tool as organizations or collectives? What we'll need in order for us to effectively conduct a gender assessment is one, within our programs, within our organizations, we need to demonstrate political will. And this political will really comes from how management is run in the different particular organizations. So the audits require, because we do know that for you to conduct an audit, you do require resources for this. You need planning, you need coordination for this. And so most of this is really built on how then management, mostly the senior management, then views this particular audit. So it will require that management then buys into the importance of having to use this audit tool in assessing the programs and projects that are being run. So it is important that the management understands the extent of the audit tool, what it is about, and what it seeks to cure. So also partly to understand why gender responsiveness and transformative action is really needed in running of our projects. So that is one of the main reasons why that you should take into consideration when preparing to do an audit, a gender audit as an organization. And then it's also important that you define the scope and clarity of the audit. So clarify the expectations for the gender audit and explain how the results that you will get will be disseminated and how action plans will be devised and how action plans will be implemented. So that also needs to come out when defining why you need a gender audit tool and why you need to carry out this particular audit. So you should also be very clear with the staff involved in the different levels of the audit to really ensure that then everyone understands the importance and the need for the audit. And lastly, it's important to then emphasize the benefits and expected outcomes for the assessment to the organization. So then so that then people actually look forward to the benefits of the assessment. What is needed in place to conduct, and this is in terms of who is involved, who to involve when conducting an audit assessment. So one is that creating a gender audit working group from across the organization is recommended as an approach. I think that is something Sarah hinted on in her presentation, but maybe going further into how to create a gender audit working group is that depending on the size of the organization, you may need from 2 to 3 up to 10 people who could be involved in the process. So select variety of people from within your organization to help generate ownership of the results and commitment to the action. So the 2 to 3 or 2 to 10 people would be good. But if it's a small organization, then 2 to 3 is recommended. But if it's a bigger one, then 2 to 10 is really recommended. And so the selecting of variety of people, these different people and how they contribute to the organization. So it could be people from programs, a different group from the PML or finance, and all these variety of people are just to help broaden the representation and commitment to what the organization is doing. So it will help generate more ownership and it will help better the results of the gender audit and and give a better result to that. So under the methodology, like I had mentioned earlier, that when doing an audit, it's important to do both an internal and external audit. So internal, it's within the organization, how the systems are run, who is involved in management, who is involved in decision making, and who is involved in running the projects. But externally is to the community that we work with. So looking at the people that we engage, the different stakeholders, both at national, maybe regional and community, we need to also involve them to continuously do a gender audit on who we are involving, but also the people that we are involving, how are they contributing to decision-making processes, and how are they contributing to amplifying voices of marginalized groups and gender-expansive persons. So prioritizing this, of course, is really dependent on the resources that you have and the timelines as an organization that you've put in place, but also heavily the organizational will to continuously do gender just work is also really important. So part of the methodology really includes categorizing the audit. So categorizing the audit can be done as mentioned, both internally and externally. And under internally, you can really look at areas of staffing and human resource. You can look at leadership and decision-making, organizational culture, gender policy, financial and resource commitment for you to then look at a gender responsive assessment of an organization, then, but of course, focusing on how then the organizational culture is quite very important on how then gender is looked at in the particular organization. For external audits, heavy focus is on projects, the programs that are running and the services the organization offers to the community. So under here, we can really look at document analysis. So this can be like an examination of existing policies, committee meeting minutes. If you have meetings, continuous meetings with communities, then essentially there should be minutes for that. So looking at the minutes, which will then help look at who was in attendance, who said what, and really looking at the quality of conversation that was going on. Also looking at budgets and other documents that help support that particular activity. So document analysis is quite important in being external audit for gender transformative approaches. Then also doing surveys. So surveys that could be both for the stakeholders that you're engaging, but also the staff that are doing the work with the stakeholders. So this is more or less quantitative data that you may need to conduct a survey to capture sort of the realities that both the community and the staff that are engaging the community are experiencing. So this is really for inclusion and diversity to guide in how then your work is affecting the community, but also how you are implementing gender just action points when engaging communities. And for under external audits, you can also do focus group discussions or internal consultations. So this is to allow for in-depth discussions on issues being researched. So for our case under the VCA, it is for climate action. So really just to allow groups to engage in in-depth discussion of issues that the project has really researched on for this much time. And as we are looking at the interim evaluation, just how much the community's knowledge on climate action really is, but also their own knowledge in their contribution to the work, what attribution would be for the organization and for the community, and who was engaged, who was involved, and all this to really to really help us be mindful of existing power dynamics within the community, but also to create safe spaces for the community. And lastly, but of course, the focus group discussions can be both internal and external. So internal for the staff that are doing the work, but also staff that is engaged with the work, but externally for the stakeholders that you are engaging as an organization for that particular project. And for this, you can have both written surveys, but also one-on-one for discussions with the communities or the stakeholders that you're engaging. On audit techniques, so there are different audit techniques that you can use, and I've hinted on some of these. Like said, the document analysis. So here you review the policies, the existing budget, the minutes, the documents, like concept notes or policies, briefs or technical papers that have been brought up under that particular organization. And then staff surveys, for focus group discussion, one-on-one discussions, and all the different discussions that you can to help engage the community further. So under VCA, we are under the PML team of VCA, we are planning agenda survey to inform the end of term evaluation for all the different organizations involved, both local and the main consortium members. So, but this particular survey will be led by a consultant, so that then there is proof of accuracy and also accountability to how the work is done. So that then it's by someone who is not heavily involved in the work for better accuracy of the work. So this will happen by next year, starting next year probably. And to see how then all the work, all the progress that we have done, all the work that we have done as a program, how that then is affecting, or how that then speaks to the gender, transformative approaches that we have done, but also the gender just work we have done under climate justice for as the program comes to an end. So under that tool, there are just very many different questions that then speak to organizational culture and systems and policies that different organizations have. So just speaking to the language that is used in an organization, also looking at the governance and decision-making structures in that organization. It also looks at the protocols and reporting mechanisms in the different organizations, just to give a feel of what of whether or not there is a gender transformative approach being taken by that particular organization. Also looking at how guidelines and budget allocation is done, but also how staffing is done in the different organizations. There are also questions on planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Really here is just to look at organizationally the developed reports and the developed monitoring and evaluation systems that are done, and also looking at the data that has been collected over the 5 years that the project has been running, 4 years now, but next year it will be 5. So just looking at how all the data that has been collected and how that then what that then looks like. Also looking at the capacity of the staff that are within that system. And like Sarah mentioned, MN is not something that is new. It has been something that we have used traditionally over and over again, but just giving it a different name. So that is also important to, those are some of the questions that are also part of the audit tool, the toolkit. The toolkit also looks at the programming. So under programming is really to look at all the existing programs and or any new proposals that the organization is running, and how all these are informed by gender assessment or analysis. So also looking at how responsibilities and obligations related to gender norms affect people that participate in the different programs, so both internally and externally. It also looks at spaces for marginalized groups to interact in safe settings. So how are you creating safe spaces for women and marginalized groups as you do climate justice work? But also looking at gender equality action plans, and also how the work that we are doing in the different organizations is contributing or elevating the potential and creativity of communities and of communities to implement climate solutions. So how looking at really shifting power of local stakeholders, of all the other stakeholders involved, without expecting them to bear the biggest brunt of the burden in getting outcomes from the projects that we are running. So this tool has been shared, and maybe later we shall reshare this tool. And yeah, that in conclusion, that's it. So thank you so much for listening. I'm open for questions and discussions.
Thank you so
Over
much.
to you, Lucian.
Thank you so much, Tricia, for that amazing presentation on the gender audit tool. We will share the link in the chat box before closing the session, but we'll also share some of the resources and presentations depending on if we are granted access from the other speakers as well. We will be sharing this in our post communications, but thank you so much for everyone who's joined. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions at the moment, and apologies for the sound in the background. It seems like things are happening in the area. But I want to thank all the speakers who have presented today, Dr. Yaliwa Clark and Gina Cortez, who had to leave the session to attend another meeting, as well as Sarah and Trisha from AMWA. And Faith, thank you so much for collaborating on this webinar session with me. We will be sharing next follow-ups, a survey, and doing some of our post-coms after this session. So please, please, please continue to engage and send us any questions. I know this is only the beginning of this conversation. It's a very important conversation to keep having. And with all the tools and resources that were shared while we're engaging, these are things for us to keep engaging with to improve them for our own contexts and for our own work. So please feel free to be curious about them and engage us further. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I think that is it for today's session.